Over 95% of the students I went to school with on Long Island were white. Over 95% of the students I taught in the South Bronx were Black or Hispanic. Segregation in New York remains a persistent problem. Segregation occurs in New York, even though New York is a democratic state, that for decades, New York has been one of the worst offenders of racial and economic segregation. And I want to talk specifically about racial segregation in our schools and in our communities. The legal segregation ended with the civil rights movement, but a lot of the holdovers, a lot of the consequences from decades of legal segregation and legal racism and even slavery have created where we are today. There's a lot of ways to think about the relationships between economic mobility and residential segregation and school segregation and what causes what. And for the purposes of understanding this, really, you just need to know that they're all deeply related to each other. Lack of economic mobility is created by income inequality that primarily impacts the people who are existingly low income. That has created a racial wealth gap in America and certainly here in New York. And that racial wealth gap and economic segregation has led to racial school segregation and communities that are segregated. Schools follow the school segregation follows the segregation that occurs in our communities. When thinking about school segregation, you can think of New York City school system versus the suburban areas and upstate New York as kind of different pots of the way to think of school segregation. Let's first talk about housing segregation because that's really the underlying aspect to the school segregation problem in New York. From the 1930s to the 1960s, we had legal, systemic racism that underpinned our housing system. Redlining was a process where big banks and the federal government colluded together to reduce access to capital in certain communities, those communities being Black communities and immigrant communities. So the federal government and banks systemically disallowed access to capital. They drew a red line around certain communities, and that reduced the amount of capital flow into those communities. Obviously, that led to a perpetuation of lack of upward mobility, essentially economic stagnation. For the last 100 years, we've also had exclusionary zoning laws that are still in place today, particularly in suburban communities. These exclusionary zoning laws perpetuate single-family housing on large lots. Each community gets to decide the makeup and the zoning laws that make up the community. But most communities are zoned in suburban communities for single-family housing, and that only allows people who have current access to capital to buy into those home locations on those lots. Now, there's obviously a case for single family housing. It's that these communities are small to begin with and they want to maintain their sizing. But in terms of housing segregation and access to certain communities, that's a huge part of the reason why certain communities don't expand. You also have gentrification. So in communities like Harlem and Brooklyn, rising property values and redevelopment projects have displaced current and longtime Black and Hispanic communities. And so as a community develops and gentrifies and more capital is flowed into the community, the people who are renters and not homeowners there need to move out because of rising rents. That has created areas where there is an increase in racial racial integration, so communities that start to become racially integrated, the minority communities are then forced out through economic means. You also have public housing in Section 8, um, uh, public housing projects. Those were traditionally, historically meant to create upward mobility, but instead they reinforced racial segregation, clustering Black and Hispanic communities together. As a result of our housing segregation, we have school segregation. And New York has some of the most segregated schools in the country. Part of that's because of that we have neighborhood-based school assignments. Where you live is where you go to school. The exception to that is high schools in New York City that for reasons of integration, they have separated your location from where you live. I'm sorry, where you live from where you go to school. A few important points to talk about when we're talking about school segregation. There are immense funding differences based on the communities, based on different communities in New York State. More affluent communities that tend to be whiter have more access to funds, and the per pupil expenditures in these school districts vastly outweighs the lower income and more minority based communities. And so you have this huge difference between wealthier white districts receiving more money than Black and Hispanic and poorer communities. And part of that, and most of that, is because our local real estate taxes fund our school system. The richer schools have a larger tax base, and that's why they have more funds. And because of those more funds, they have better facilities, better programs, more access to AP classes, and all sorts of better resources. I also wanted to mention a huge part of the debate over racial segregation is the specialized high school system in New York City. Schools like Bronx Science and Stuyvesant that are reliant on a specialized high school SAT, a special test to get into these schools. That has been a huge debate, probably a separate YouTube video, but this has been a huge debate as these specialized high schools are misrepresentative of the general New York City population, where far more white and Hispanic students are in those schools relative to the more diverse makeup of the school system. There have been integration efforts over the last century. Most of them have failed because of pushback from wealthier, more predominantly white communities. These efforts have included busing, and there have just been immense resistance to racial integration as a large scale goal. The big question is, what direction are we moving in? Are we moving towards a more racially integrated future, or are we still stuck in 1950? And the tragic answer is it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell, and there have been a lot of recent studies, one by Governor Hochul only a year and a half ago, that studied racial residential segregation. There have been studies by UCLA and other nonprofits that try to measure the impact of integration efforts. And the truth is, there hasn't been a lot of progress. Part of that's because since the 1980s, there has not been a lot of racial upward mobility on the economic front, and that has led to people remaining in the social class that they were in 1980 and not moving into communities that are wealthier and therefore whiter. Not therefore whiter, that are more wealthy and happen to be more white. There's, as I said before, there's these relationships, and I don't want to say one's causation and one's correlation, but they are all correlated with each other. It's that economic disparities continue to increase. The racial wealth gap, therefore, tends to increase. And therefore, lack of mobility tends to increase, residential segregation persists, and school segregation persists. And those relationships are, it's hard to tell what causes what and uh, what should be the focus of it. Should we be focused on the schools or we should be focused on the economic mobility? But they're all related. There have been efforts to address segregation, whether it's affordable housing initiatives in New York City, school integration policy and busing. There have been a ton of anti-discrimination laws that have been passed that don't allow real estate brokers to recommend some communities versus others. A lot of the anti-discrimination laws have lax enforcement. Uh, and there have been obviously the biggest effort to address racial segregation in our schools is economic initiatives to reduce inequality in our broader job and economic markets.